Good evening and welcome to Moral Politics. I'm your host Valerie Tarico and this is our monthly series, Christianity in the Public Square. Sarah Palin, the vice presidential nominee, is a member of the Assemblies of God denomination, or rather she was for almost 20 years prior to the start of her public career at which point she began moving among several churches, but she continues to worship in the Pentecostal tradition. What does Assemblies of God believe? Sarah Palin's church, Wasilla Assemblies of God, has put out a doctrinal statement that lets us know what her denomination believes. But Marlene Winell, psychologist and former Assemblies of God member, has personal experience with the denomination. She's here with us tonight. Thank you for joining us, Marlene.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
So I have to start, of course, with the news that broke a couple weeks ago now, I believe it was, about Sarah Palin getting blessed to protect her from witchcraft during the opening phases of her bid for the governorship. Witchcraft. How does this, is this kind of normal Assemblies of God talk, or is this something outside the norm?
Well, witchcraft fits with their paradigm. Their paradigm is very different from what we would consider a normal view of the world, and this is a very important point, because the issue with, people are worried about Sarah Palin and her Christian views because of her stand on abortion, on homosexuality, on the environment, on a lot of issues, but
right. The general concern has been not evidence-driven, not kind of scientifically interested,
right.
Not knowledgeable. But witchcraft seems like a different kind of
Well, that's because
issue.
In my mind, the problem isn't so much these particular issues. It's not her views. It's not her attitudes on any of those things. The problem is that she has a completely different paradigm for looking at reality. She has a different take on reality than the rest of us do, that are more that what we would call secular or grounded in the normal physical world. And this is true for people in the Assembly of God. It's true for, any evangelical Christian who believes that there's a spiritual world that's happening in addition to the physical world. But in a Pentecostal circle like the Assembly of God, it's more pronounced, it's more literal. There are devils and angels that are battling, and there are territories that are governed by evil spirits, and they will do exorcisms around geographical areas and what they call spiritual warfare.
So, a couple years ago, I was actually speaking at a conference of Hindus, and one of the stories that I heard was a story about, a horrifying story about two young Hindu girls who were burned to death by newly converted Christians in the north of India because they were perceived to be witches. Horrifying, as I said, but I assumed that this whole idea of witchcraft was there in the culture, that these were people who were kind of new to Western ideas, that they took the Bible literally in ways that no Westerner actually would. And it sounds like you're telling me, because I know that Assemblies of God does major missionary work in Africa and South America and India, that this idea of literal witches could have come from our country to theirs? Would Sarah Palin's church believe in real witches?
Yes, if you consider a witch to be somebody who is being controlled by a demonic force, definitely. And that's why they don't want kids to read Harry Potter. And
because it's real to them?
Yes. Yes, I told a family member my child went to Harry Potter camp, and there was this dead silence. I'd forgotten that it was a big deal. Because yes, they think that Satan can control you and make you do things that are evil, that things can be demonic. And by the way, they also consider various activities to be demonic, like pornography or gay sex, and then the comments about why the Twin Towers came down. These are
why did the Twin Towers come down?
Well, because the forces of Satan were on the side of the Muslims that caused it.
Because
Well, in the larger scheme of things, America is on God's side. Didn't you know that? I mean, we have manifest destiny. We're blessed by God. And by the way, part of why Christians are so against some of these things that they consider to be our moral problems, our homosexuality and our abortion and these things, especially sexual sins, is that they're afraid that God's blessing on America, and by the way, they believe that America is blessed by God, that God will remove that blessing. And there's a verse in the Old Testament about how God removes blessings and that God raises up rulers, kings, and he can take them down whenever he likes.
So you're saying you learned all of these things in the Assemblies of God denomination, which Sarah Palin worshipped in exclusively until 6 years ago, and now worships in on a regular basis, mixed with other evangelical services.
Right, and she, she's distancing herself.
Well,
and
with good reason, it sounds like.
And this is part of a strategy that the religious right is known for. They do what is like a stealth candidacy, where they keep their beliefs under wraps, and they'll join school boards or textbooks approval committees or local and state government, and then once they're in, then their beliefs are more apparent and their policies come out because they're really interested in enacting God's will in our society. And so they are traversing these two parallel universes. They're mostly interested in the spirit world, but then they'll step back into this physical world to try and enact what they think God is supposed to have them do. And so this is a major point that I want to make. Decision making is not something that you make on your own. You do not just use your own judgment and your own wisdom and gather experts and find out what would be the best course of action. Decision making in this literal Christian Bible believing way is something that you do by being open to having God tell you what to do.
Well, many Christians believe that God tells them what to do, but it sounds like you're talking about something more intuitive, less intellectual, less informed.
Well, it's not like what God would have me do, like, in the moral sense of it, like what God would have me do in this situation would be to try to achieve the best, most just outcome, to distribute these resources, this food to these poor people, and because that would be fitting with Christ's teachings. That would be more mainstream Christianity.
So please tell me you're not talking about foreign policy decisions.
Oh, I'm definitely talking about foreign policy decisions. George Bush said that God told him to go into Iraq. And the thing about this kind of decision making is that you can say that God said this to you or God led you to do this, and then justify whatever it is you've done.
How put yourself back in your former Assemblies of God self. What does a decision feel like? How do you hear the voice of God? How do you know what he wants you to do?
Well, the difference between a charismatic group and just a run-of-the-mill Christian church is, or even an evangelical church, is that a Pentecostal group claims to have what they call a second blessing, or infilling of the Holy Spirit.
That's the speaking in tongues?
Well, that's
part?
the evidence of it. That's the evidence
okay.
of it. And so speaking in tongues, prophecy, and prophecy, by the way, isn't just prediction of something in the future. Prophecy is something that, or a word of knowledge. It's like God is like letting you know right here and now something.
Before the show, you confess that you actually still can do the speaking in tongues. I have to ask, can you give our audience a demonstration?
Well, let's see. You have to get into like a kind of trance. And by the way, I had a really good time as a child. I don't know if I can do it right here and now, but
we'd love to see you try.
Yeah, I could go on, but you sort of sink into it, and it gets more intense as you sort of enter a trance. I mean, you can create a trance.
And so, when you're doing the speaking in tongues thing, does it feel like there's I'm sorry. When you're speaking in tongues, does it feel like the words have meaning? Is it about...
Well, the thing is that spiritual, like mystical experience, mystical experience isn't unique to Christianity. Mystical experience is like an altered state. Altered states happen all the time. And you have it with all sorts of, you have it in levels of meditation, you have it in Sufi dancing, you have it in long distance running, you know? You have all kinds of altered states in which you achieve what some of the same exact feelings are, which is a sense of oneness, a sense of ecstasy, a sense of connection, and people have interpreted that as being spiritual and being connection with God.
Mm-hmm.
And so Pentecostals will get this experience, often in groups, because there's a group trance happens, and there's group hypnosis, and they've got the musical thing down pat. There's certain kind of music that facilitates it. And then you have a minister with a microphone who's making all these really powerful suggestions. And then you have the group suggestion of people doing certain things, and you follow suit. And people fall down on the floor, they speak in tongues,
So, Marlene,
and then
are
pretty
you
soon people are telling us what God is saying. So it's a direct conduit. So I was saying, unlike the other kinds of Christians, Pentecostals think that they have a direct line.
Okay. So let's come back. Wasilla, Assemblies of God, what do they teach?
Well, they teach this. So on top of the atonement, the accepting Jesus Christ as your personal Savior.
Atonement, what does that mean?
The atonement is what evangelicals and fundamentalists believe, where you have to confess that you're a sinner, and Jesus is, accepting Jesus is the price.
So it's the blood sacrifice, interpretation of Christianity.
Original sin, you're sinful, and that's another point too. I'll get back to that, but you have to be saved in order to get to heaven. Heaven and hell are literal. These are all Assembly of God teachings. Heaven and hell are literal.
So a literal city, a literal lake
literal
of fire?
Places. Hell is a lake of fire, and non-believers are going to go there to burn for eternity. There's a timeline and God's plan, starting with a 6-day creation, going through the Old Testament deal, which was different. Jesus came, and then there was the Christian deal, and then there's going to be this apocalypse at the end.
So Sarah Palin, coming out of that tradition, would not just be a creationist, but a young earth creationist. Is that what you're saying? That the tradition teaches a literal 6-day creation,
Yes.
6,000 years ago, or however many thousand years it can be calculated from the biblical
Yes.
genealogies. Wow. Wow.
Yes. So yes, they believe that there's this direct connection to God, and so when you want something, you can ask God, and for some reason God's gonna like readjust His plans to suit. It's a really strange concept, but in that little talk she gave, which was only 6 months ago, or not even 6 months, but it was in June.
To the graduating missionary group?
I mean, excuse me, she's back at the church. She's had a close relationship with this church. She's back there speaking, and she's asking them to pray for the pipeline, and then she asks them to pray for the men and women in Iraq, because they're going over there doing a task for God.
So you would see this as as evidence that she still believes in this spiritual warfare, God directing her impulses or intuitions, is that correct?
Yeah, and then she got blessed by the pastor there, and who had a prophecy, or somebody, there was a guest evangelist who had a prophecy and prayed that she would become governor, and she was all amazed by that and was saying how powerful that was coming from that church, and so she clearly believed that God had a hand in her becoming governor. And so now, as a national leader, she is going to continue to seek God's will and consider herself an agent of God in a powerful position, put there by God in order to do things to enact God's will. There's no way out of this. And this is why this is why I'm trying to be clear. It's not her attitude on abortion or whatever or anything like that. She, and the way I say this, and it may sound funny, but Sarah Palin's on a mission from God.
What is that mission?
That mission is to get into a position of power and to enact God's will in the way that she thinks, in the way that she interprets it. And that is very frightening.
Based on what you know about Assemblies of God, what would be a mission from God in that tradition? What does God want people to do?
Well, she's going to be trying to bring our nation back to what all these folks consider to be a Christian nation based on our founding principles, which they think are Christian.
They think that the founding fathers were Christians?
Yeah. Well, they think this whole country is based on Christianity and that we have a role in the world to be spreading Christianity and to be holding that up. And we have a role in the world to make it possible for Jesus to come back and
how do Assemblies of God believers get Jesus to come back?
Well, there are certain things that they are now that they interpret to be requirements for the second coming, and one is to spread the gospel all over the world. Their missions program is huge. My parents were missionaries for the Assembly of God. I thought I was going to be. My brother is a missionary, and part of the mission is to spread the gospel. The Great Commission that Jesus said, and this is where Sarah Palin is not off the hook. Jesus said to spread the gospel to every nation on earth, every person, every nation on earth. And that's called the Great Commission because that's what we're supposed to do while we're here. Otherwise, why don't we just all kill ourselves and go to heaven?
So you think that Sarah Palin would have an obligation as vice president or as president to use that office to spread Christianity?
Use that office to spread Christianity, use that office in whatever form. It might be to enforce certain moral codes that she thinks we have to have in order to be Christian.
Can a good Assemblies of God member take an oath to the Constitution of this country?
Well, see, there's another thing. The attitude towards government is that government is something that is from God, that God puts into place. There are a couple verses in the Bible that tell us to respect the government, but only to the extent that God has put it there and has put those rulers in power. Now, they also are very strong about how if there's any conflict between civil law and what they consider to be God's law, that there's no question, you obey God's law. So,
can she take an oath to the Constitution?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think she has any right to, because her belief system says very clearly that that is not the law that she will ultimately uphold.
It's interesting that I've heard fundamentalist Christians make the argument that a Muslim should not be able to hold a higher office because their loyalty to the Quran trumps their loyalty to the Constitution. And ironically, it sounds like what you're saying is that the reason they perceive all Muslims in that way is because they themselves, taking a fundamentalist perspective, think that their own holy mandates trump the Constitution. And so you've got kind of a parallel set of hierarchies which says perception of God, holy book, then loyalty to country and to the ideals upon which it was founded.
Even to the point where it's okay to break the law. It's okay to break the law if what you think is obeying God's law. And missionaries talk a lot about smuggling Bibles, doing all sorts of tricks and stuff to get the gospel into places where it's not supposed to be, and
the end justifies the means.
Yeah. So, why do we want somebody in office that has that attitude towards law? I mean, we have worked very hard to have a rule of law in this country, and our justice system has worked for many, many years trying to continually examine our laws. I mean, Roe versus Wade, it was an examination of, what do we want here, and we're trying to evolve. We've taken laws off the books that are not just. We've gotten away from slavery. We have a changing view of law in trying to make it work. And we're trying to make it work according to our own judgment. And that's the other thing. With a Christian point of view, with this biblical Christian point of view, you do not have a positive attitude towards human beings as far as having any wisdom, any judgment, any internal kind of love and strength. It all is supposed to come from God. So she's not going to be trusting her own judgment, and that's why it doesn't matter that she's qualified or not. I mean, people are saying, oh, how can she think she's qualified? Because in her mind, she doesn't need to. All she has to do is listen to God. God's going to tell her whether or not she can, what to say to Vladimir Putin, you know?
So
she doesn't need to figure that out.
In this mindset, what would one be looking for in advisors? If you were an Assemblies of God woman suddenly thrust into the vice presidency, what would you be looking for in your advisors?
Well, you wouldn't necessarily want expertise, as far as just expertise on government and state matters, because you might want expertise as kind of an extra, or you might want to have Christian experts, you know, somebody who's got some knowledge of, say, South America, but who's also a Christian and who's familiar with the forces of Satan in South America as well. But
And if you had to pick one or the other?
Yeah, non-Christian expertise would not be nearly as valued. And she's famous as a governor for firing people, right and left. She fired all sorts of people. Why is that? People that were making...
her supporters would say it was about corruption. It was about cleansing government, reducing government. You've got a different interpretation.
Well, I don't have all the facts of who she actually hired to replace them, but what I'm saying is that there's not a big value on expertise, and there's no value on human knowledge, and there are all these denigrating statements in the Bible about human knowledge, calling it foolish, and trusting ourselves is the worst thing to do, because we're gonna set ourselves up for a fall. We have to trust God and not trust ourselves.
So do you think most moderate Christians, I know Christians who think of the Bible as a human construction, as our ancestors struggling to understand God, struggling to understand what was right, how to live in moral community with each other, and then working to put words on that, working to put metaphors on that. This type of Christianity that you're describing is very different. It's even far beyond what I was raised in as a child, as a non-denominational evangelical.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think people have any idea how different it is? Or do you
No.
think they just hear the word Christian and then they think, oh, she's a Christian, she loves Jesus, I love Jesus, it's cool?
Yeah, I don't think they do understand, because this view is, the Bible, the inerrant meaning there's no error whatsoever, and never mind any of the contradictions, never mind the actual history of how the Bible got put together, because all they really look at is what's in the Bible, not how it was made. They don't want to know that. There's a lot of willful ignorance about that, because it's the holy book that people cling to. And again, it's fear-based. It's fear-based because it's a guidebook. You know, they'll say, this is the guidebook for life. And they say, this is the guidebook not just for your spiritual life and your moral life and guidelines for how to treat people. It's the guidebook for everything. It's the guidebook for government. It's the guidebook for schools. It's the guidebook. And I'm always amazed at that. And I say, well, is it the guidebook for cell phone etiquette? You know, or for astronomy and actually, I mean, it's full of all kinds of errors, but nevertheless they consider it a guidebook, and they'll search in it for things that are just absurd, because it's actually worship of the Bible more than it is worship of God.
I've heard, and I've used on this show, the word bibliolatry, in fact, making the Bible itself into a golden calf, and giving it the attributes, perfection, kind of eternity, completeness, that most people would attribute only to their idea of deity. You're saying, in this tradition, Sarah Palin's tradition, Assemblies of God, that's how the Bible is viewed.
Yeah, and if she's calling herself an evangelical Christian, and she's saying that the Bible is the Word of God, even if she's distancing herself from the Assembly of God, still she, in order to be true to that identity, she's going to have to see it that way and behave in that way, the same way you might say, if you call yourself a fish, you have to swim in water. You can't call yourself a fish and then say, oh, you want to be elected to office over on the land over here.
Thank you for joining us tonight. I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of give us an insider view of this tradition.
You're welcome. I enjoyed being here. Thanks for having me.